On this episode of Grief for Breakfast, we are talking about grief and relationships, specifically the way grief affects relationships within a family unit. Grief messes with everything. Family relationships are tricky in the best of times, even in a really good, solid, loving family, if you've got one of those. When somebody in a family system dies, things get messy. Maybe somebody is sad, another person is angry, fights are breaking out over who gets to sit in what row of the church memorial. Maybe one person wants a certain kind of grave marker and another person wants another thing. Like, there's a lot of infighting. Everybody has a different need, and if you're like me, you want to make sure that everybody gets their needs met, so we're trying to fit all of these different parts into one beautiful whole where everybody gets their needs met. So here's the thing to remember. When one person dies, each person in the family lost somebody different. Think about it. So let's say that your mom died. You had a different relationship with your mom than your brother did. Your dad or the surviving parent had a different relationship with their partner than you did. One person died, but each member of that family or each member of that friend group lost a different person. This means that everybody's grief is going to be different. What we often look for is consensus or coming together in all of these things. And honestly, what is much more helpful is to recognize the places that we're different, honor the unique ways that we grieve, the things that we need in these emotionally challenging times, to recognize that we have differences and there is no one-size-fits-all solution for grief. Not in family groups, not in friend groups, not in the world. To add one more layer to this, grief is a form of stress. What happens to communication skills under stress? People don't always behave in ways that are skillful or compassionate or understanding. There can be lots of irritation and frustration and knocking of heads, right? People tend to be more of who they were before the loss. So somebody who tends to be argumentative and judgmental will be more argumentative and judgmental. Somebody who tends to keep their feelings to themselves and pull back might very well keep to themselves and pull back. Grief is a form of stress. Stress can make communication break down, and everybody's grieving. Everybody has needs, and juggling a bunch of different needs on an average day can be tricky. Juggling a whole bunch of needs under times of emotional distress, really, really hard to do. So let's break this down and come up with a couple of things that you can do to help navigating grief in a family system just a little bit easier. So my number one thing that I'm going to start with is boundaries. Boundaries for everybody. Just because you understand that people are having emotional responses, that this is a stressful situation, and of course, tempers are frayed and all of those things, grief is not an excuse for abusive behavior or bad behavior. You can say things like, just because you're grieving doesn't mean you get to call me names. Just because dad just died doesn't mean you get to break furniture in my house. Those are extreme examples, but you get what I'm talking about here. I'm going to lead this top things you can do to manage grief in a family system by saying safety is our number one priority. It doesn't matter what anybody is going through, abuse, verbal abuse, name calling, violence of any kind, doesn't matter what's going on. None of that is ever acceptable, right? Boundaries for everybody. That can also be things like, I know you're sad, but I still need you to eat your breakfast. I know you're having a really hard time sleeping, and I still need you to let the dog out. Whatever that looks like, right? So boundaries, expectations, and clear communication, which leads us to important thing number 2, communication. Being able to recognize what you're experiencing, being able to look at your family members or your friend community and recognize, oh, hey, they're experiencing grief as well. It looks different than the way I expect them to or the way that I'm feeling it myself, but they're a different person. So that makes sense. Having that conversation with yourself to recognize, ooh, there's some friction here. Oh, that person is doing something that I wouldn't do in my grief. Let me just recognize that they are a separate human being with their own unique relationship to the person who died. Just that reframe can give you a little bit of breathing room, so maybe you take their expressions of grief a little less personally. Communicating with yourself to recognize that all loss is different, all expressions of grief are going to be different. It can just smooth off the rough edges for you a little bit so that you don't take things quite so personally. Now, phase 2 of communication is obviously having a conversation, being able to communicate with the people around you. Grief does not happen in a vacuum. Love doesn't happen in a vacuum. Community is literally not a vacuum. How are you going to talk about the differences in the way that grief is getting expressed and getting managed and getting handled in a family system or in a friend group? We already talked about boundaries in terms of abuse and violent behavior, all of that stuff, hard stop. But to be able to open a conversation with the people in your family system, in your friend group, to say things like, we all had our different relationships with them. All of our grief is going to be different. I don't think that we can do one memorial that meets everybody's needs, but maybe we can talk about the things that are most important to have in this and see if there are a few things we can agree on, right? Do you hear what we did there? We named the problem. We all have our own unique needs, and we're sort of battling over who gets to make the decision and who is right and who is wrong. There is no right and wrong in a family system other than violence. You named that we're having some conflict and some friction because we're all different people and we're trying to agree on something in an emotionally tense and fraught situation. Can we not do that? You're also naming a reality here that there is no way you were going to have consensus in one event, to use this example of the memorial. You're just not. There is no perfect memorial or funeral or ritual that is going to bring that person back or make grief go away. And you can't make everybody happy. One really highly skilled way to address this is to name it, and also to say, there is not going to be one perfect thing that meets everybody's needs. Can we see if we can find a few pieces that feel really important so we feel like we've got something that represents us? This is high-level skill here, friends. These are emotional, relational tools that we don't usually practice in daily life. But the reality is that we don't need a death to practice these skills. Just on deciding what's for dinner, you've got different needs, different tastes, different opinions. Somebody's right, somebody's wrong, somebody's not hungry. How are we going to deal with that? How are we going to talk about that in ways that are respectful and also help to build a sense of connection alongside our differences? The same principles apply in grief. It's just a little harder to apply them. So everything that I've been talking about requires some emotional bravery. It requires some relational bravery. This is a really vulnerable time. A lot of times in grief, people sort of pull back to protect their hearts. They feel a little raw and prickly, sometimes for good reason. But having that emotional bravery to name what's actually happening and try to work together while respecting the differences that are very real and very valid, that's how we build community. And that's how we build family.